Welcome to the On the Tape podcast. I'm your host, Danny Moses. Great guest today, Dr. Jim Walker from Aletheia Capital. Jim, welcome to On the Tape.
Hi, Danny. Good to see you.
It's a pleasure to have you. And you coined the phrase Asianomics years ago. You launched your firm in 2007. We used to talk frequently. We're going to get into that and the history of it, but there's no better person to talk about what's going on right now, certainly as it relates to China and all of Asia and our policies and so forth. But before we get there, a little background on when you started Asianomics. You were one of the first kind of independent research firms to kind of go out post-crisis and really make a name for yourself, and I think became a very important part of the research process there. So talk about the evolution of that.
Yeah, well, I had been the chief economist at CLSA, as you well know, one of the stockbrokers in Asia from 1991 to 2007. And believe it or not, when we launched Asianomics, it really wasn't that clear that there was a crisis at all. The markets had actually peaked in October 2007. And when I was leaving CLSA's offices, I was told by one of my colleagues of 16 years he could understand why I was leaving, having got it so wrong about the apocalypse that was about to unfold on us. But there we go. So things actually did start to go our way, as it were, both my way and your way, when you were at Front Point in the following year. And, Asianomics went from strength to strength until MiFID II came into focus and into play in the mid-teens there. And of course, that set independent research back. One significant step, that's for sure. But in 2018, I took Asianomics onto a slightly different platform, which is Aletheia. Aletheia Capital is really an analyst network. It's not really a fund manager in any way. So it's all about research, and it's all about trying to give people ideas of where Asia stands in the global economy. And that's what we just keep trying to do.
Well, you are a student of the Austrian School of Economics versus the John Maynard Keynes School of Economics and Government Intervention. Talk about that a little bit to kind of set the stage here, because I think that's very important in how you view things across the world.
Yeah, well, I suppose that really dates back to when I was at university, and I was lucky enough to be at a university that had a few professors in it that had a wee bit of a different way of thinking about things. And I got hooked on Austrian economics at that time, which still seems to me to be the right model for economists if they're actually trying to help people both in the investment world and just in the real world, because it looks at things in a very different way. It stops looking at the aggregates. And I mean, I keep talking to people about macro economics and about the macro economy, but I don't really believe in that much. I think that the world is made up of myriad businesses that are interacting with each other, where people are all the time trying to make plans about the future, whether they're workers or whether they're business owners. And with those plans, they set their stall out and try and get on with life. And then along comes government and puts an overarching view of the world on them and ruins the plans. Politicians are really good at one thing. They're really good at opening their mouths and making sure that it disrupts everybody else. And I think that's the Austrian world versus the Keynesian world. The Keynesians think that everything can be solved by government action. The Austrians think that everything can be dissolved by government action.
Well, the Keynes theory was born out of the Great Depression, if I'm not mistaken, kind of the mid-30s. And you and I have lived through, not back then, thankfully, but we did live through the GFC and so forth. And I want to go back to the point that you made. You know, when you look for a crisis or things are out of sorts, you're always going to be early, to your point. But I want to talk about the Thai baht devaluation in 1997, just as an indication for how you think about things and how you see things coming, and how a currency and a move which is really prevalent, are really going to be pertinent, I think, today in various, we'll talk about the yen, obviously, in a little bit, but what you saw and what it means and how did it unravel?
Yeah, I mean, that actually, the trigger for talking about the Thai baht in the mid-1990s was actually the Mexican crisis in December 1994, which obviously had a significant impact in US policy and effectively on the world, because Mexico was seen as the poster child of a rock-solid peso against the US dollar. The imbalances didn't matter that much as long as the country kept going with the currency policy. And then there was a crack, and then the peso devalued and all hell broke loose. But we wrote a report in January 1995, which was just, as I say, a month after the peso devaluation, saying, could a Mexico happen in Asia? And at that point, what we looked at all of the different features that had led up to the Mexican crisis, and it was really about current account balances and just the inappropriateness of a fixed exchange rate at that point. And the country that stood out in Asia as a candidate for doing a Mexico was, I'm afraid, Thailand. And we said that at the time, got me into all sorts of problems with the Thai authorities, including the central bank at that point. And then for the next 2 years, we certainly looked early, that's for sure. But eventually the reality came home to roost that the baht was overvalued. The policy was unfortunately attracting an awful lot of speculation against the Thai baht and against the country. But it was all of their own making by fixing the exchange rate. When you get prices out of alignment, the way to deal with that is to realign. And this is one of the teachings of Austrian economics. You've got to have flexibility. Unless you're in something like a gold standard, and then other things adjust. But when you fix currencies, you think you've succeeded because you were fixing them at a low exchange rate and everything was going gangbusters, except inflation gets out of control, and that then counteracts all of the underappreciation of the undervaluation of the currency, and then you end up with a huge trade deficit, as Thailand did, and various other problems, including far too low interest rates overseas that the Thai people were borrowing at. So it was a crisis that was in the making for a couple of years, but it was a pretty obvious one coming. So we were just a wee bit early on that, but we got the story right eventually.
And soon after that was long-term capital. And it always seems to be currencies that trigger a lot of this. And we're going to get into the tariffs and so forth. And the irony is that Thailand is one of the most affected by these tariffs that have gone into place, which I know you have thoughts on as well. So you just got back from Asia. You were there you're there all the time, but you were basically on a whirlwind tour, various countries and what you're seeing, what's going on, I think. But let's start with the policies the U.S. has implemented most recently as it relates to tariffs, which I know is just a scattershot approach. And I think you agree with that. And people making these decisions, this goes against every Austrian school of economic policy that's kind of out there. How's this going to play out? And most importantly, with focus on China, which you know better than anybody, how do you think this thing plays out over a period of time here?
Everything's up in the air, Danny, because we don't know from one day to the next what the tariff structure's going to be like. I mean, he brings out boards of writing, and every country is labelled, and they've all got these various tariffs to pay. And then we go into hiding for 2 days, and all of a sudden it's delayed for a month, and then it's all back on again, and then it's going to be 90% tariffs for China because they've retaliated, and then it's 145% tariffs for China. And it's crazy because, you know, the one thing that was in place before all of this started was supposedly a roadmap produced by the chairman of the Council for Economic Advisors for President Trump. And that roadmap, Stephen Murand was the architect behind it, tells you that the only way that tariffs work is if they're set at optimal levels. If they're set too high, the welfare benefits to the country setting the tariffs are actually negative. So what was the optimal tariff? Well, he basically said it was no more than 20%. And yet so many of the countries that President Trump listed were facing much, much higher tariffs than that. And certainly it's not anything like 145%. That's just trade stopping. You don't even get the benefits of the revenue flow from the tariffs when you set them at 145%, because there's nothing to flow. There's no trade. So this was a very strange period in which, as I say, the blueprint and the ballpark was there for the imposition of relatively modest tariffs, because what Miran had done is he'd gone away and looked at the trade war that took place in 2018, 2019 between China and the US, and he concluded that that trade war was nothing of a war at all, because in actual fact inflation didn't rise in the US because of higher tariffs. The currency adjusted, in other words, the renminbi depreciated. That meant that the Chinese actually paid the penalty of the tariffs because they became weaker through that weakening of their own currency. Chinese companies didn't get as much money back as they were getting before when they were selling their goods, because the currency had depreciated. The US, on the other hand, with an appreciating dollar against the renminbi, offset all of the tariff increase. And so this was a very kind of clear, as I say, roadmap of, if we just adjust slightly and the currencies adjust in the right way, then we won't face any inflation problems and everything will be hunky-dory. Well, I'm afraid in the first 99 days or whatever it is of President Trump being in office, all of that's just been thrown out the window. It's a busted flush already, because the dollar has weakened and the tariffs are much higher than the optimal tariff that was suggested, or the very low tariffs that were being suggested in the Miran paper. So we've now got a position where there's definitely going to be inflation in the US as a direct result of these tariff impositions, and it's just a question of how big. Now, that's the China story, because the Chinese retaliated, and then I'm afraid President Trump decided that he would play hardball, because I think everybody had told him that the Chinese will capitulate at that. Certainly wasn't the story I was hearing when I was in Beijing a couple of weeks ago. But the other countries around Asia are effectively even harder hit in many respects. And let me just give you an example of that, because I was in Japan and Korea as well as China. And of course, last week, the Japanese trade minister was in Washington to try and negotiate a deal and reduce the tariffs for Japan. This week, the Korean trade minister is in Washington trying to do exactly the same thing for Korea. These are two allies, by the way, of the United States. And those allies are feeling it much, much harder than the Chinese in terms of the economic effects of the tariffs. The Chinese might actually lose all their trade with the United States. That's around about 2.8% of their GDP. They've actually increased their fiscal spending this year by 2.5 percentage points of GDP, which means it's almost entirely offset if they lose every single penny of trade with the US. And that's basically what people were telling me in China when I was there, that, you know, they expect a hit to economic growth, but not a dramatic one, because they've offset it with fiscal policy. The reduction in growth in Japan that was being forecast was around about 40% from their target for this year, which was only 1.2 anyway, and they think it's going to about 0.7. In Korea, they're going from 1.2, 1.3% GDP growth this year to zero in terms of their expectations for how this will affect them. And at the same time, what those countries are being forced to do as part of the getting away from the tariff strategy is invest in America. Invest in the industrial capacity of America, the manufacturing capacity of America. And this is part of the reindustrialization story. But as I was trying to point out to clients today, and you've already seen this paper, Danny, it's all very well to talk about reindustrialization and a big investment inflow, which will then be rewarded by lowering of the tariffs, except that there's no people in America that can man these factories. The US is at full employment. Miran says that 2 million jobs have been lost as a direct result of China stealing activity away from the US, and that's the words that he uses. But if you create 2 million jobs today, you're going to go to 3% unemployment, which is a record low for the United States. I mean, we're at 4.2%, that's full employment. Even if there was the ability to find workers, skilled workers to man the new manufacturing factories and the new industrial growth there, it would take the unemployment rate to levels that are only associated with inflation. So, I mean, this is the most crazy mixed up story that I think I've seen in the last 35 years of being in Asia and 45 years of being an economist.
So, Dr. Jim, don't let the facts get in the way of the, quote, good story that they want to tell you on these tariffs. And your point about 2018 and 19 is a good one, because COVID came around and basically wiped out any of the impacts that we would have seen or would have had. So let me go back to China for a second, because you're mentioning before how U.S. businesses, and you wrote about this, and we've been talking about this on the podcast, are already slowing things down. They have to. They had already planned for 2025, and that's being interrupted, but they're making now 2026 plans. These are large companies, some public, some private, that have to plan for the future. And uncertainty just creates that, right? Just creates these issues. So here we are. Who's going to blink? Who's not? Who's talking? What trade advisors are talking to who? What does China really, I mean, they obviously care. Logic will prevail at some point. When is it, and what does it look like? And do we end up just causing all this ruckus for no reason at all? What do we end up getting out of this, the U.S. potentially, if anything?
Well, I'm trying to work it out, Danny, to be quite honest. I mean, here's the thing. That President Trump likes to be known as the kind of great disruptor. He's the negotiator. He needs to set out a negotiating position. He's got to be unpredictable. Not all negotiators need to be unpredictable, but he seems to feed on unpredictability. And, you know, basically, as you've quite rightly said, all that is certain when you adopt that approach in negotiating with people is that you increase uncertainty. And when uncertainty increases in the economic world, investment goes down. And this has been our story to clients all this year, that what you've got to expect as a result of the approach that the US is taking just now is a recession is coming. That there's no way, in my view, of avoiding a recession this year in the US and probably globally as a direct result of the negotiating position that the United States has taken. Now, in my view, the US does not benefit at all from a recession. The rest of the world doesn't benefit from a recession. The two countries in my universe that actually probably are relatively not quite ring-fenced, but more immune than others to this trade disruption and investment disruption in the global trading sphere are India, very obviously a very domestic economy, and believe it or not, China. Because although trade is still important to China, the total export percentage of Chinese GDP is only 17% now, used to be higher. The US component is less than 3%. And the fact is that increasingly the Chinese have been moving towards trying to do a lot more in terms of their domestic economy, having got the big problem of property out of the way. And, this is something that probably we don't have time to talk about today, but, people have talked for the last 3 years about the Chinese having a property crisis. I've tried to say time and time again, crises don't last 3 years. Governments, when they see a crisis, take the sledgehammer out, think 2008 here, and they hit the problem as hard as they can to try and avoid further damage from the crisis. China, on the other hand, with their property sector, consistently went for 3 years to try and reduce the size of property, to try and shrink it as part of the economy, and to effectively bankrupt certain developers that they thought had been acting not particularly well in the property sector. So that wasn't a crisis, that was deliberate policy action. And what they announced effectively last September was that problem was now over, and they would go on to relaxing things on the property side and in the domestic economy during 2025. And they're still in that mode. But it means that 2025 is a domestic growth year for China, and probably going into 2026 as well. So the two countries most, as I say, immune to this whole trade war situation are ironically maybe China and India. The US, I'm afraid, just doesn't win here. It's not a massive trader in itself. It's just the disruption that it brings to everything else in the economy as a result of that. Now, just one example there. The US doesn't export very much to China, but US companies export a lot to the US from China. So one of the things that I was looking at earlier this month was the percent, again, talking about 2018, 2019 trade war. What was the percentage of exports flowing to the US that were actually Chinese companies? Because we have, and again, this is the great Keynesian idea of macro aggregates. So we keep talking about China trading with the US and the US deficit with China. This is such a loose use of language. And it's very, not so much disconcerting, which it is to me, but it's very disturbing that we've bottled everything up and put it in such an easy label, China against America. Whereas in actual fact, what we're talking about is a constellation of companies dealing with another constellation of companies. And some of those companies that are based in China are American. And some of them are German, and some of them are Japanese, and some of them are Korean, and some of them are Chinese. But it's not the Chinese government that's dealing with the US government, it's businesses. So in 2018-19, the estimate that the Peterson Institute came up with was that between 60 and 70% of the exports coming from China to the US were not made by Chinese companies. They were made by multinational companies. And 20 to 25 percentage points were actually made by American companies. So maybe think Apple. And this is the real problem that we've got just now, that what is going to be hurt most in terms of this whole trade war is the profits and the revenues of American companies that are based elsewhere around the world, but in particular in Asia and in China. And that was, by the way, over $1.2 trillion worth of revenues in the S&P 500 index last year.
Well, the U.S. consumer, right, is the be-all, end-all here, and they're going to be impacted, to your point, by higher prices. Whether they take the price and cause inflation or whether they don't and cause a slowdown in the economy remains to be seen, but it's certainly one of the two is going to occur. China, to your point, doesn't depend on its consumer as much, obviously, as we do. So let's talk about, most crises are born out of bad fiscal management by the government itself. We're messing around now with debt to GDP approaching 130% here in the US, $37 trillion of debt. You can't afford to make these miscalculations, to your point, and misstep and have a self-induced recession, because it will spiral on itself, to your point, and potentially cause our yields to rise. And so everything is being done out of sequence here. So talk about how important it is to focus on debt to GDP here in the U.S.?
Well, it's actually going to be my next publication, Danny. I've talked a wee bit about it in the past, but this is really critical. The US is running a 7.5% of GDP budget deficit at the moment. As you quite rightly say, the total debt level is $35 trillion. It's just a massive number, 100% of GDP. But what's really important is how much needs to be financed in any given year. So what I was trying to do was look at the US debt rollover for 2025. And that alone is estimated at $7.5 trillion this year, which is 25% of GDP. So the US is going to be rolling over in its marketable securities, so just the treasuries, 25% of GDP. Now, how do you finance that 25% of GDP? Of course, a lot of people will just roll over stuff that they've got. And usually, foreign investors in the United States who have been selling goods to the US, they've had US dollars back to pay for those goods they bought, treasuries, they would normally just roll those treasuries. It's not quite clear to me today that an awful lot of foreign investors in the United States will be that keen to roll over their treasury holdings. Would they be better buying gold? Would they be better buying Swiss franc government securities at minus 0.2% interest rate? Would they be better taking it home to Japan? Because we might well talk about the carry trade from Japan. But basically, there's a big chunk of the people who hold treasuries at the moment that might decide not to bother refinancing them. Now, one of the things that I've been looking at in terms of the Austrian approach is how the US, or where the US finances its treasuries from. And it's, of course, the domestic market, banks, households, funds, etc. It's the international market. It's the Fed, which can monetize the debt, which has its own inflationary consequences. Or it can increase taxation to pay for the fund flow into new treasury rollover. But if you take one of those four components of what makes up the treasury payments, the treasury fund flow, if you take one of them out, which is the foreigner, then the rest have got to make up for that. And either that's monetization and the Fed doing an inflationary episode, which at the moment they don't seem very keen to do, although maybe next year when there's a new Fed chairman, they'll be keener, or households and banks and funds in the US have got to step up to the plate. Now, I think when it's 25% of GDP, that's asking an awful lot of them. And certainly they're going to demand an interest rate, a significant interest rate, in order to do so. Now, I'm actually being quite kind here, because that's in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. If we're looking at the amounts that are required to fund the deficit in terms of US savings, it's 41% of the savings rate that has to go into treasuries alone in the US now, rather than into productive investment. So this is the mess that the US is in with respect to, I'm afraid, its fiscal position. And to be quite honest, at the beginning of the year, I thought that's probably what President Trump is going to focus on, rather than focus on starting an international trade war, because it's better only to fight, and sometimes quite difficult battles, on one front, rather than opening huge amounts or huge numbers of fronts all over the place and trying to fight a war that can't really be won in these circumstances.
So we're alienating the two largest holders of our debt, China and Japan. We're talking about cutting taxes, so we're messing that up. The Keynes theory of printing money, great, wonderful, but you're going to have inflation, in terms of any way out here. Let's focus on Bank of Japan right now, because I always tell people I think they don't care. They probably shouldn't care, but at some point they might care about the yen's strength and what that means and their ability to protect their own economy. So Bank of Japan meets this week. This episode will come out Wednesday morning. I believe we're going to see a decision Thursday. We're not expecting them to raise rates, obviously, but talk about Japan a little bit. And then I think your point is a good one about kind of China coming to the rescue, or kind of replacing us to a degree within the Asian economy, and certainly India, that we've seen before, and how this structural shift may just continue regardless if we try to walk these things back. But start with Bank of Japan, and let's get a situation if the yen were to strengthen to, 125, 120, and why that can trigger a financial crisis.
Yeah, well, now, but when I was in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago, nobody was talking about 125. Some people were talking about possibly 135. Of course, this is very typical of economists and market analysts. They don't really look at what is the worst possible outcome for them. They tend to think in terms of, we could just about cope with that. But here's the kind of great irony for Japan at the moment, that they've been very slow, obviously, to raise rates. They're currently sitting at 0.5, 0.5. If I were to ask you when was the last time that they were above 0.5, Danny, I think you would, maybe even you wouldn't realise that it's more than 30 years ago that they had interest rates above 0.5%. So if they go to 0.75 in June, which is what a lot of people still think, that'll be a game changer for Japan in terms of a 35-year stint. But so this is a real tricky one for the Bank of Japan, because obviously there's been the carry trade over the last few years, which Japanese people have played pretty tremendously. That's now over. And the question mark for them is how far do we go with the possibility of that move to 125? Now, in terms of Japan's currency, whether that makes it uncompetitive or not, that really doesn't matter particularly much. For the Japanese stock market, it really matters hugely, because guess what's been happening for the last few years? The weak yen has had a translation gain effect on Japanese profits being returned to Japan. So everybody kept talking about the great Japanese earnings position, and the fact that the market was looking really good because earnings were looking really good. Well, they weren't really good. All that was really good was that the yen was falling. And over the last 2 years, Japan has been at the bottom of our list of Asian investment stories. That hasn't always been right, by the way, but it's been at the bottom of the list because it's got nothing to do with fundamentals. It's a currency play. And it's probably still a currency play. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The Japanese were looking for, as I say, about 1.1%, 1.2% GDP growth this year. So here we are, 35 years of 0.5% interest rates, 250% debt to GDP, huge fiscal deficits, huge efforts to stimulate the system through money printing, this, that, and the next thing. And after 2.5 years of inflation, which has, by the way, led to the fall of the LDP as a government, because people in Japan absolutely hated the fact that inflation got up to as much as 3% and 4%, because they weren't used to that. So they voted the government down, even though there was no opposition. But here they are at this kind of level of GDP growth after all that effort, 1.2%, and then the possibility that tariffs are going to reduce that by around about 40%. But they're absolutely nowhere near a sustainable, decent growth rate, because the investment picture in Japan has remained as flat as a pancake over that whole period of Abenomics and into the current period of the inflation coming back that was supposed to stimulate economic activity. It just hasn't happened. So they're kind of in steady state, Danny, that's the thing. And the only question now is what kind of messes are going to be around about that steady state growth of basically 1% and no more that they can hope for than that. The only thing that has saved them in terms of a stock market is this weakness in the yen that has translated into foreign exchange gains through the corporate earnings of overseas Japanese companies. Now they are under threat because a lot of those Japanese companies are based in China.
That's right. And I would say the one theme here is global central bank interference or printing of money over time is finally coming home to roost. And it comes up every podcast at this point, not just my podcast, everybody's, has been gold. And I've been talking about gold for years, but to me, it is the gauge. It is the report card right now for everything that's occurring. Talk about your thoughts on gold and why it's so important.
Yeah, well, I'm bang there with you, Danny. We put a buy on gold in our global strategy in 2024. It's by far our best investment advice of the last couple of years. But it was there specifically as an insurance policy against effectively the blowout in government spending. The United States has theoretically had the last 3 or 4 years and the 2 or 3 years before COVID as well, where economic growth has been reasonably good. And yet the fiscal expenditure and the fiscal deficit kept rising year over year. Never mind the COVID period, 2021, when there was the big injection of funds. But this just kept going in terms of government putting money into the system to try and keep the train on the tracks, as it were. And when you look at the two elements of the US economy, manufacturing, which is, of course, the strategy of reindustrialization that they keep going on about, manufacturing quite literally has been dead in the water for the last 3 years in the US. If you look at the purchasing managers indices, the ISM survey, prices haven't been going up in the manufacturing sector, and the overall PMI itself has been in the kind of 50 range, but quite often below the 50 boom bust line. But if you go to services, which are the big beneficiary of government spending, and actually included in services as the government as well, the services sector in the US has been racing away. That's where the jobs have been created. That's where the prices have been going up. That's where the activity is. And so if government spending goes down, if we have a recession for any reason, the services sector of the economy is going to not quite implode, but it's going to slow down with it. And that's really going to add to the real distress in the US economy. But that's all because fiscal expenditure is out of control. There's so many moving parts at the moment in this thing that almost everything that is done creates a problem somewhere else now. And I'm afraid that's not usually good news for economic activity.
I've talked about that in terms of services dominate the U.S. economy. We technically run a, quote, trade surplus with everybody on services, yet we focus on the goods and what they perceive as some type of deficit, which makes no sense. So one other issue that makes gold trade higher are geopolitics. I want to just hit Taiwan here because we keep forgetting in the background here as a China-Taiwan potential thing that may or may not happen or the threat of it happening. What are your thoughts on that since you've been on the ground there? I'm sure you have some thoughts.
If you'd asked me 3 weeks ago, Danny, I would have said absolutely no concerns whatsoever. I've been in Asia for 35 years. Hardly anybody ever talks about Taiwan or China in the context of confrontation. And of course, there's always been flickerings of problems with blockades and occasional missiles being fired over islands and what have you. But that was usually way back in the 1990s. But when I went to Beijing this time, on the first day, two of my contacts, and I mean, my contacts tend not to be young guys on the investment banking side or the stockbroker side, sitting in analyst chairs and they're on fire all the time about what the markets are saying. I'm speaking to people who are usually in academia or certainly working for think tanks and what have you. And two of them said to me, for the first time in 35 years, we're worried, or I'm worried, about a conflict with Taiwan. And when I look at the positioning, you know, one thing I should say at this point, I really wonder if anybody in the administration in the US understands that the Chinese can read. Because when you read Miran's paper about the blueprint for a new global trading system, it is just a litany of anti-Chinese rhetoric. Not just rhetoric, it vilifies China. It's that China is down there as the villain of the piece. You know, if they're going to try and get a group of nations to put China in a box in the corner somewhere, and that's exactly what Miran says in the paper, where they all put on tariffs on Chinese trade as well as the United States. Did they really think that the Chinese are just going to sit back and say, oh, well, we had a good run, see you again in 100 years? Or are they going to say, how would it be best to hurt the global economy? Well, the best way to hurt the global economy is for TSMC to stop producing, because it's the biggest semiconductor producer in the world and one of the most important cogs in the wheel of the global engine. And TSMC is located in Taiwan. I know it's got a factory in Arizona, but I'm not quite sure that that's really up and running yet. But if you wanted to bait the Chinese and put them in the position of feeling that their only option to hit back in a not a particularly nice way for being seen by the global economy or the allies in the global economy as the villain, well, why not be the villain? So there's talk of war in China at the moment, and it's very disconcerting. It was the first time I've ever heard it, and it worried me to death when I heard the kinds of guys talking about it that I heard.
I just think there's so much going on. We forget about all the other stuff, which is already has been going on. It's kind of in the background that could rear its head. All right. So lest anyone think we're all doom and gloom and we don't have fun on the side. You're an owner of racehorses. You follow the Morton Football Club religiously, right?
Yes,
I'm a partial owner of horses here. Obviously, we have the 151st running of the Kentucky Derby coming up, part of Starlight Racing. We have the one-horse Citizen Bull and the four-horse Rodriguez, which I'm going to get into later in a Derby preview. Talk to me how you got into the horses and your other passions in life, because the best part to me about Wall Street has, and is always the characters that you meet. And you're an out-of-the-box thinker. You don't care about conforming to anything, which is, I actually think, what brilliant people like you do. But how do you keep yourself occupied outside this research circle with horses, et cetera? Yeah,
well, the horses do play a big role in that. And that's why I keep doing this, because I need to pay for feeding them. And they take a lot of feeding, let me tell you, and there's certainly a lot of money for training, as you well know.
You know what they say, Dr. Jim? That they say, don't own anything that eats while you sleep. And that's the definition of a horse. But please continue, yeah.
But I suppose I got started on it when I was 4, Danny. That was the first time I went to a race course. I introduced my granddaughter, by the way, to racing when she was 4 weeks old. And it was quite a nice introduction, because the horse that I took her to see won the Queen's Cup that day at Musselburgh, but I don't actually think she'll ever remember that, although she's reminded of it every so often. But Yeah, I started when I was 4, going to racing, betting, obviously with my dad putting the bets on, and it kind of grew from there. When I moved over to Hong Kong, racing was a big part of life in Hong Kong as well. And eventually I had horses in Hong Kong as well as in the UK. It took a while as a stockbroker to build up the funds to start buying racehorses, but I did actually manage it. And at the moment, I've got 5 on the go. One of them's the half brother to the horse that you can see behind me here in the wall, which was Subjectivist, that won the Ascot Gold Cup in 2021. Unfortunately, individualism's not quite as good as Subjectivist, although the name, I think, is just about as good. The other 4 are the usual ones that I have, which are a cross between a donkey and something with 3 legs, as far as I can see. But we keep going with them. And because Subjectivist is now a stallion, I've managed to get myself hooked on brood mares. So I've got 5 of them in the go as well just now. And I can assure you that's no less expensive than running the horses themselves. But it's mostly racing, and that's certainly what will take up my time in the next couple of months, because the football finishes next week. But for my sins, yes, and well, partly because I come from the west of Scotland, I support a football team called Greenock Morton, who, if there's anybody out there with any money, help, because we need all the help we can get. I went to see them at Kirkcaldy on Saturday against Wraith Rovers, which we drew 1 each. They're in this, what is effectively the 2nd division in Scotland, which isn't particularly good, but it's good fun. And those 2 things keep me pretty busy, and certainly pretty engaged.
Yeah, and you post on X under Dr. Jim_Walker, and you can see some of your horses that you post there. I always say that gambling on horses, forget the ones that you own. It's always, of course, people like me and you will gamble on your own horse, which makes no sense. But you never look at the odds board first, because it will sway your brain. I think you approach research the same way. Don't let a currency level tell you. Don't let rates tell you. Look under the surface. And so it's great the work that you're doing. Keep informing people. And how do they find Aletheia Research? And I know it's aletheia-research.com, I believe, but how can they subscribe or become a client?
Yeah, well, actually, if they go into the website or get in touch with me through Twitter or whatever, ask to go on the mailing list, somebody will get in touch with you. Somebody will come back from the sales team, and you'll see that there's a whole bunch of really good independent analysts on that platform that cover things from global commodities to tech hardware to China internet and global strategy, Asian strategy, and tech thematic. It's a real kind of mix of people, almost like a stockbroker. Makes me feel at home.
Well, Dr. Jim Walker, I can't thank you enough for coming on. You're going to be really busy. I have a feeling you're always busy, but really busy over the next several months. Look forward to having you back on and talk about what is a result of all these policies. So thank you, Dr. Jim.
Good to see you, and all the very best, and best of luck with the racing this year.
Appreciate the good wishes, Jim, on the Kentucky Derby. Here I am to preview the 151st running of the Kentucky Derby, to be held this Saturday, May 3rd at approximately 6:57 p.m., going 1.25 miles on the first leg of the Triple Crown. For those who don't follow the Triple Crown, it's the Kentucky Derby first, 2 weeks later, the Preakness, and then 3 weeks later, the Belmont, the true test at 1.5 miles. This is 1.25 mile race. It has 20 horses in it, to which no one in this race has ever run with 19 other horses in it. So let's go. Let's start with the 2 horses that I'm personally involved in. So, it's going to be a heart trade here for me, which is the number 1 Citizen Bull, currently 20-1, and the number 4 Rodriguez at 12-1. And remember, odds can change all the way to the start of the race. Both horses trained by Bob Baffert, who's going after what would be his record-breaking 7th Derby win. And he's back for the first time since 2021. For those who may or may not remember, we had Bob Baffert and Jack Wolf, the owner of Starlight Racing, on the pod back in 2021. So Starlight was started by very close friends of mine, Jack and Lori Wolf, around the year 2000. And their first big horse was named Harlan's Holiday. Harlan's Holiday went on to sire Into Mischief. Into Mischief went on to sire Authentic. Both the 1 and the 4 horse are directly related to Harlan's Holiday. So I feel good about completing full circle there. Let's get some other horses I am watching. The number 5, American Promise, at 30-1. Definitely going to be a sentimental favorite is Dwayne Lucas, who's a trainer. He's 89 years old. He's also won 4 derbies. And also of note, the 5 slot has won the most derbies. So coming out of that slot has won the most. This horse has actually raced 9 times, won the Virginia Derby, not against huge competition, but he did. And I love the fact that he raced 3 times at Churchill Downs in the past. This horse is 30-1. He was sired by Justify, a Triple Crown winner that Starlight also had a piece of. On to the 7, Luxor Cafe. Even though he's 15-1, which is considered somewhat of a long shot in the latest Derby odds, no Japanese horse has ever won a Triple Crown race. He is the son of American Pharaoh, the other horse this century to win the Triple Crown other than Justify. So I like you kind of going to sprinkle something on him. Probably I'll give you my picks at the very end. Number 8, Journalism. He's the current favorite at 3-1. His last 3 races, including the Santa Anita Derby, have only had 4 other horses in them. Again, this is 20 horses that are going to be running in this race, and none of these horses have had 19 other horses bumping up against him. So yes, he's 3-1. I'll include him somewhere, but I don't love him for that reason. Number 9, Burnham Square, ridden by Brian Hernandez Jr. Early odds are 12-1. This jockey is important. Rode Mystic Dan to victory in 2024. He's raced at Churchill, which I like, but he's a gelding. Only 10 geldings have ever won the Kentucky Derby. The last one was 2009. He did win the Bluegrass Stakes. He is a closer, and Hernandez's first ride on him was in the Bluegrass, so I find that interesting. The 13 Publisher, the only reason it's getting any attention is Rod Ortiz, the best jockey in the world, is on him. Like the number 7 Luxor, he is sired by American Pharaoh. It's the best jockey. I think he gets attention, but I don't think I would put him in the money. Number 17, Sandman. Jose Ortiz is on him. It's won the Arkansas Derby and raced 3 times at a 2-year-old at Churchill Downs. Again, these horses that are familiar with the track, I do like. The trainer, Marcas, is 0-10 in the Derby, but at these odds that he's 6-1, here's the problem. He's coming out of the 17 slot. No one out of the 17 slot has ever won the Derby, and I don't love those short odds 6-1 coming out of the 17 hole. Lastly, Sovereignty, the 18 horse, Bill Mott, Junior Alvarado running on him. He's won twice at Churchill as a 2-year-old. He is also by Into Mischief, just like Citizen Bull. He won the Fountain of Youth and second in the Florida Derby, and he's a closer, something to think about. So my heart says a 1-4 exacta box. It's my Starlight box, obviously, with Citizen Bull and Rodriguez in there. And then I think you've got to do a 1, 4, 8, 17, 18 exacta box and a trifecta box. I'll let you decide the denominations about how much you want to bet, but that's what I like. And then a 10-cent superfecta, which I believe in 7 horses, cost $84. Again, I don't give investment advice. I don't give gambling advice. I'm just saying if you want to have some fun, a superfecta box, you got to get 4 horses in any order, right? Top 4. So I would do the 1, the 4, the 7, the 8, the 9, the 17, and the 18. Lastly, this 5 horse that I mentioned, American Promise, if he goes at near 30-1, I know I didn't include him in the superfecta, but I think you got to have some money on him across, which is win, place, and show. So I'll be back hopefully later in the week with some special drops. Maybe could be a Bob Baffert, could be a Jack Wolf coming in. So stay tuned.